Hey everybody, this is the beginning of our final unit in our class. We're going to be reading Susan Douglas's book, Where the Girls Are. The title of that book comes from a 1960 movie, Where the Boys Are. That was one of the first movies to deal with teenage sexuality. It was something of a groundbreaking movie of the time. And we're going to be talking about things like teenage sexuality in the post-war period. And so that's where the title comes from. This image you're seeing here is a screenshot from the movie. Now, as I told you towards the beginning of the class, Susan Douglas's book is different from all the other books we've read so far. All the other books are centered around a particular genre of popular culture: silent movies, swing music, comic books. The focus of Douglas's book is the relationship between popular culture, the mass media, and girls and women. We'll talk about her particular thesis to the book in a little while. But it's not so much centered on any one area of popular culture, but rather the intersection of gender and the mass media. We're going to talk about music and television, news media. There's a greater variety that we're going to be dealing with in this unit, and I kind of like that towards the end of the semester. There's a bit more variety. It's the end of a long semester. Coming to a conclusion, we could all use a break. And I like the variety of this book for the end of the semester. Not only are we going to be dealing with multiple areas of popular culture, but Douglas's book is also different, that there's something of a memoir feel to it. None of the other authors we read in this class so far really talked about themselves very much, or their generation, or their personal interaction with popular culture. But Susan Douglas really does. In a lot of ways, she's describing her generation of girls, and then teenagers, and then young women, and then career women, and their interactions with the mass media, with popular culture. There's something of a memoir feel to the book. Right? And don't get me wrong, this is a work of history and cultural studies. Susan Douglas is an excellent historian. She wrote a really wonderful history of radio. So it's not simply a personal estimation of popular culture of the time, but there is something of a memoir feel, which makes some parts of the book quite compelling. All right. Now, to begin with, we're going to go back to post-World War II American society. This was the society of Susan Douglas's childhood. We've talked about aspects of this before, but we need to go back into it because it's so important to understanding Susan Douglas's overall interests during this period of time. One of the dominant features of American life after World War II was the prosperity of American society after the war. Again, we've talked about this. And let's be clear right up front, not everyone was sharing in this prosperity after World War II. Poverty was still a thing. But in general, there was a growing standard of living that was happening in the United States. I talked about this previously. Gross domestic product, GDP, increased from 1945, the end of World War II, to 1960 by almost 50%. Or I'm sorry, not 50%, almost 100%. It almost doubled. GDP, remember, is all the products and services that an economy produces. And so the American economy was almost twice as productive in 1960 as it had been in 1945. This was generating a lot of jobs, a lot of increased wages, a lot of new consumer goods for people to purchase. And there was this feeling by the end of the 1940s through the 1950s into the early 1960s that the American economy was reaching a new kind of state, that there were growing expectations of a kind of never-ending growth to the American economy, that some switch had been flipped and America was in a new position. And so it was creating expectations of sort of unending plenty. Things are good and they're just going to keep getting better. What was much of the feeling that was going on. Home ownership increased by 50% during that same period of time, 1945 to 1960. A lot of people coming from the working class, the lower middle class that had never previously been able to afford to buy houses, now in this post-World War II period, we're able to buy houses increasingly. This is where we see tremendous surge in suburban tract home building. The cost of building homes came down. And more people from the working class and the lower middle class were buying homes than ever before. What was driving the American economy after World War II was consumerism. All right, we've talked about consumerism before. Consumerism is not simply buying things. Consumerism is an ideology. It's a belief that buying things brings happiness. And one of the dimensions of consumerism is that as time goes on, the things that are expected as necessities expands and grows. Once upon a time, people didn't have refrigerators in their homes, and yet people survived. Through most of human history, there were no refrigerators, and people survived. But as we get into the 20th century, refrigeration technology becomes more commonplace, and the price of refrigerators as common household items drops. And so by the time we get to the post-war period, almost everybody has a refrigerator inside of their house. This comes to be seen as not a luxury. When refrigeration first was invented, it first made its way into the homes of the wealthy, the rich. It was a luxury item beyond the imagination of average people. But by the time we get to the post-war period, the price of refrigeration has come down, and now it becomes seen as a necessity. You have to have a refrigerator. What we see is a growing expansion of consumer needs after World War II. Things that either had never existed before or were once upon a time luxury items come to be seen as necessities. Homes become more available, more within the reach of more common people that you could own. Home ownership expands. And what do people do when they buy homes? They fill their homes up with stuff. The whole post-war boom in kitchen appliances, for example, is something we see. Refrigerators, new modern stoves, things like blenders and mixers. And by the way, they should all match in, banana yellow or avocado green. There becomes this expectation for things that didn't exist or were luxuries that come to be seen as we need those things. We need to buy those things. Televisions, we're going to have a whole lecture on televisions later on. During this post-war period, come to be seen as a necessity for the middle class home. This consumer spending is driving the American economy after World War II. And so consumerism becomes the center of the American economy, as it still is to this day. We talked previously about changing gender roles, or a return to expectations after World War II that women stay home and men go out and work. A kind of traditional notion of domesticity becomes a part of cultural and societal expectations after World War II. As we're going to talk about in a little while, Susan Douglas has a little tweak. There's a difference between some of the perceptions of this domesticity after World War II and some of the actual realities of what was going on. Oh, I'm sorry. I have to plug my computer in. Here we go. Sorry about that. Well, let's talk about that right now. One of the things Douglas talks about in the book, and that she's fascinated by, were the cultural contradictions of the post-war period. Those two things I was just talking about, consumerism and expectations of female domesticity, women staying home and not working, were in direct conflict with one another. As American consumerism grew after World War II, there was a growing expectations of things that a normal middle-class family was supposed to have. You were supposed to own a home. Now, middle-class Americans had long owned homes. That wasn't new. But now lower middle-class and working-class families could now aspire increasingly to buying homes. Automobiles. As America becomes more suburban, automobiles become a greater necessity for many Americans in many parts of the country. You needed an automobile, and increasingly, 2 automobiles for a middle-class family. Dad needs that car to go to work every day, but increasingly, mom needs a car also for running errands and doing activities with the children while dad is away. One car's just not cutting it anymore. You need 2. All those appliances that the home needed to be filled up with, refrigerators and blenders and toasters, television sets. Somebody had to pay for all those things. There were growing expectations about middle-class children going off to college. Remember when we, I'm sorry, I was about to describe something that I was dealing with in another class. You guys weren't in that class. College in the late 1800s, first half of the 20th century, was a rather expensive thing that was relegated mostly to the wealthy and the upper class. As we start getting into the second half of the 20th century, there were attempts to provide more state education and lower the cost of going to college. That no longer was college something simply for the wealthy or the extremely smart that could get scholarships and go on there. But smart kids who weren't necessarily brilliant, nor that came from rich families, were now also increasingly able to go to college. Cal State Fullerton is a wonderful example of this. A school that was created in the late 50s that allowed for inexpensive college education. This was becoming a more common expectation for the middle class. Middle-class families needed to try to save some money for their kids to go off to college. This was another expense. Medical costs were going up. There were greater expectations about the need for medical treatment. Think of dentistry and the advances in dentistry. Look, man, 100 years ago, your kid's teeth start coming out in crooked ways. Hey, that's just too bad. Your kid's going to kind of be funny looking when they smile. But now with modern dentistry, there's things like braces that can straighten teeth out. That becomes more of an expectation. And so there's this growing consumerism, more and more things to purchase, consumer goods, services that need to be paid for in the post-war environment. Well, one of the ways families could find money to pay for more of this was for the mother to start working. As there was more pressure to buy more and more goods and services, it was becoming increasingly difficult for a single family income, just the father's income, to pay for everything that was needed. One of the ironies is that at the same time there were these expectations that women stay home and not work, you actually got an increase in married women with children going into the workforce. Okay, again, I've told you this several times before, but I'm going to do it one more time. Women have always worked. Poor women have always worked. Working class women have always worked. One of the things that's really becoming different is in this post-war period, the increase in married women with children working. This was something of a new thing. Now, to understand how this was taking place, we can think of this almost in a push-pull term. Okay, on the one hand, families needed more money to buy more and more consumer goods and services. All right. And so women were going out of the home to get jobs, sometimes part-time, sometimes full-time, to help the family pay for these increasingly needed things. There was also a pull that was going on, and that was the American economy needed more and more workers as the economy grew. So remember, I've told you, between 1945 and 1960, GDP almost doubled. America was making almost twice as many things and providing almost twice as many services by 1960. Well, to do that, they needed more workers. As economies expand, they require more workers to get stuff done. Yes, you can use automation for some of this in economic growth. You can try and become more efficient. But ultimately, as economies grow, they need more workers. And one of the readily available sources of potential labor that was out there were women, right? American families needed more money to buy this stuff that was available, so women were going outside the home. That's the push. The American economy, as it expanded, needed more workers. The economy was increasingly willing to hire married women with children. Married women with children were often the last kind of worker that an employer wanted to hire back in the day. The thought is that married women with children are not reliable workers because their husbands often aren't going to be supportive of this. If one of their kids gets sick, they're going to call in and say, I can't show up to work today because I got to take care of my kid. That was the fear. But it turned out that married women with children were actually quite stable and reliable workers. They were older, they were mature. Often the kind of part-time jobs that a lot of these married women with children started with as they went into the economy, the competition for those jobs were often young people and teenagers. No offense, but young people and teenagers aren't usually as reliable as older people. Turns out that married woman with children that was working and had that job, she was going to show up because her family often needed that money. It was important for her family. She was going to show up. The teenager maybe needed that money, maybe didn't need that money. Maybe was a bit more flaky. So, despite the early reservations about hiring women with children, um, as the economy became desperate for workers, they started hiring more of these women, and they turned out to be perfectly acceptable workers, did a fine job. Now, what was allowing these women to take more of these jobs? Well, these were the mothers of the baby boomers. Okay, these were the moms of that baby boom generation. And there was a kind of demographic thing that was going to happen that allowed these women a kind of opportunity to go out and work that hadn't existed maybe for some previous generations. One of the things that was unique about the baby boom generation was how young people were getting married after World War II and how young women were when they started having children. You show me a society that has a high birth rate, a society where women are having lots of children. I will show you a society where women are having children young. All right? To have a big family, to have a lot of kids, that woman has to start having kids early. Okay, you start having kids when you're 32 years old. You can't have that many kids simply because the clock's going to run out on you, probably sooner rather than later. You start having children at 19, that's a long period of time to start having kids. One of the things that happened after World War II, and we talked about this at the end of our swing music unit. Remember we said part of the reason the swing era ended so abruptly is as World War II ended, that swing generation grew up overnight. Men returned from overseas. Millions of American women were forced out of factories and out of their jobs at the time. The economy was booming. Young people got married, and they got married young. And because the economy was going well, these couples could often buy homes relatively quickly. Suburban growth, the greater production of homes meant the cost of homes was relatively inexpensive compared to historical standards. There were a lot of jobs available for men at the time. Why not get married young? Why not start having kids young? Right? So men and women were getting married earlier after World War II. There was more economic stability in the upper working class, middle class. Often people wait to get married until they feel more economically stable. Often people wait until they feel economically stable before they start having kids. Well, because the economy was doing so well after World War II, people were getting younger. People were having children earlier. So let's take a hypothetical to get us to understand this. Imagine a high school sweethearts. Boy is a year older than the girl. They both graduate from high school. He's 19, she's 18. They get married. They save for a couple years, are able to get a down payment on a home, one of these newer suburban tract homes. And after 2 years of marriage, they decide to start having children. The first child shows up when the mother is 21 years old. She spaces out her children every 2 years. She has a child at 21, 23, 25, 27. Just 4 kids, all right? Above the average of certainly what we have today. 4 kids, okay? Some families had fewer children, some families had more children. But this baby boom generation comes from families having more kids than previous generations or than today. So a family with 4 kids. That mom is done bearing children at age 27. She's done. Okay. By the time that youngest child is in school, maybe around the age of 5, mom is now 32 years old. And between around 8 o'clock in the morning and 3 o'clock in the morning, there are no kids at home. The family could use some more money for all those burgeoning consumer goods that were out there to buy. Mom talks to the husband and says, hey, what if I get a part-time job while the kids are at school? We can, it will afford us to have more money for the things that we need in life. Husband is like, fine, no problem. Suddenly now a woman is working. Earlier generations waited a bit longer often before having children. Today, women wait longer than having children. If you waited until you were 26 to start having kids and then having 4 children, spacing them out every 2 years, now suddenly, maybe by the time your kids are in school, you're in your late 30s. Well, you get a little bit more tired by your late 30s. You've been away from the job market. Maybe that woman had a job when she was a teenager, but that was 20 years ago and she hadn't held a job in that long. Maybe you don't want to get a job now. Susan Douglas tells us one of the reasons that women were able to go act and get jobs while they were married with children is precisely because they started having children so young and stopped having children relatively young so that they had this free time while their kids were in school to go out and get jobs. So one of the cultural contradictions of the post-war period is precisely at the time where the stereotype was that women were not working, women were exclusively staying home, you were actually getting an increase of married women with children actually working. And they were doing it because there was this increasing pressure to keep up with a middle-class standard of living that was hard to maintain if only the father worked. All right? Really interesting discussion in the book when she talks about that. Again, kind of counter to some of our images of post-World War II American society. Douglas talks about how there were growing opportunities for girls after World War II. The perception is, and we talked about it, the cultural perception was this period after World War II was a very conservative time, almost a backward trend in terms of expectation for girls. And that was there. And Douglas is going to write a lot about that. But there were also growing opportunities for girls and young women, raising expectations for girls like Susan Douglas, who was a girl growing up in the 1950s, about what was possible for her. So, for example, she talks about education. Education became a greater priority for the United States during the Cold War. We talked about the Cold War in our last unit and this competition between the United States and the Soviet Union. And one of the things that the United States realized was that this competition was not simply with soldiers in the field of battle, but this was going to be a competition of science and engineering and mathematics. That the country that could develop the most advanced weaponry was going to have an advantage over the other one. Douglas writes about the importance of the Soviet satellite Sputnik. The Americans after World War II just assumed that the United States would be the first country to send a satellite into space. The Americans had almost already written into the history books before it happened. And in 1957, the Soviets sent the first satellite into space. It was called Sputnik. And this was a tremendous shock to the American sense of pride. Remember that I talked about that sense of a zero-sum game between the United States and Soviet Union during the Cold War? Well, if the Soviets had the victory of sending a satellite into space, that means by definition, we the Americans have lost. And so the Americans redoubled the effort. We need to get better at science. We need to get better in engineering and mathematics. We need to do a better job of educating the next generation of Americans. All right. And so the federal government becomes much more involved in education than ever before. Education had always been seen as largely a local issue, a city issue, a county issue, a state issue. But now the federal government realized, no. We, the federal government, have to do more to support education. So money really starts flowing in from the federal government for elementary schools, junior highs, high schools, universities. There's this flood of money and priority that's placed on education. And Douglas writes about, look, girls were beneficiaries of that. All right. When a new high school was built, a new modern high school, that high school wasn't just for boys. It was also for girls. Throughout American culture and society, as education was becoming more prioritized, nobody was saying out loud, or generally speaking, it wasn't said out loud, hey, this is just for boys. It was often couched in more neutral terms, in terms of the next generation. And girls were part of that generation. So a girl like Susan Douglas growing up was just under the impression that I am part of this new generation for whom education is a new priority. Right? And so when many in the federal government, when men in the federal government often thought about producing more scientists and engineers, more people in lab coats, yes, they were often thinking of men. But the girls growing up at that time, they weren't necessarily thinking that this future didn't involve them. And so there were growing expectations for this. Douglas writes about the importance of John Kennedy. Kennedy becomes president in 1960. And it's a little easier to explain the impact of Kennedy for your generation than it was maybe, let's say, 15, 20 years ago. Because your generation understands the importance of Barack Obama's presidency. Obama was different. He seemed to bring about a reckoning of a new generation, a new kind of America. By the way, that doesn't mean everybody supported Obama or all young people supported Obama, but he clearly hearkened an image of a new kind of America. All right? That's what Kennedy's election felt like in 1960. He was a very young president, and he talked a lot about being part of a younger generation, a new America. And so people from Susan Douglas's generation who grew up, she was a little too young to actually vote for Kennedy. But she remembers being inspired by Kennedy because Kennedy seemed to be this young, good-looking, vibrant president that seemed to be part of her generation. Kennedy once famously said in a speech, and Douglas quotes the speech in the book, "Let the word go forth that the torch has been passed to a new generation." He was talking about his generation, and Susan Douglas felt like that was her generation. A torch has been passed to a new generation. That's me, she thought. Right? Kennedy didn't say, let the word go forth that the torch has been passed to a new generation of boys, of men. Douglas thought she was part of that new generation. And this generation, and she's describing the baby boomers here, felt their importance. See, the baby boomers were such this large demographic bubble. There were just so damn many of those boomers that they've always been important. When they were little kids, there were so many of them. Companies and manufacturers wanted to sell things to the parents of the baby boomers for their kids. They wanted to sell toys. Television created programs for kids. As they became teenagers and that first generation of rock and rollers, record companies wanted to sell stuff to them because there were just so damn many of them. The boomers have always felt this sense of importance because there was just always so many of them. The American economy and society accommodated the boomers, always recognized the importance of this group of people. They were different. As they were voters, there were so damn many of them. Whatever generation they were, when they were young, when they were middle-aged, as now they're elderly. They get a lot of recognition because there's so many of them. And so Douglas talks about growing up with this sense of importance, of being part of a new generation, of growing up with this sense of feeling like she was going to change the world. Her generation was going to change the world. And it wasn't immediately obvious to her that that didn't mean her as a girl. She grew up with these expectations, these growing expectations about what a girl could do as part of this important generation. But this is where we now start to get to the thesis of Douglas's book. What Douglas is really interested in is the mixed messages you got growing up after World War II as a girl, and then a young woman, and then a woman. Growing up female after World War II meant being bombarded by mixed messages. On the one hand, you were told, Douglas argues, that you are an American and you are part of an important generation, and you can do anything because Americans can do anything. That was one message you received growing up in the United States. On the other hand, there were plenty of examples from popular culture, the mass media, in which young women, girls, women were told, no, you're just a girl. Lower your expectations. You really can't accomplish that much. Stay home. Serve the needs of men. Know your role. Stay in your lane. And Douglas says it was confusing. It was always confusing. Because on the one hand, sometimes you're being told you're an American, you can accomplish anything. On the other hand, you were told, no, you're just a girl. Lower your expectations. And that's what her book is about. Tracking these mixed messages from the mass media, from television, from movies, from music, from broadcast news, from commercials. You always got these mixed messages. Sometimes you were an American that could achieve anything, and then other times you were just a girl and stay in your lane. And that's a lot of what her book is about tracking that. What it was like to be a kid growing up with that, what it was like to be a teenager growing up with that, and then, later on, what it was like to be a woman growing up with that. So really pay attention to Douglas's discussion of these mixed messages. So, for example, she talks about getting, in the first chapter, mixed messages from television. On the one hand, as a kid growing up, you watch television and you watch the network news. All right? News Look, this is all before the internet. This is before everybody was walking around with their phones. And so news came from newspapers and television news. And television news was really popular. After 5:30, 5 o'clock, you'd watch the local news, and then after that, the network news on the big networks came on. Lots of people watched these things, and it was an important source of understanding the world. So Douglas says she would watch the news with her family, and the world was filled with excitement and change. There were wars going on. There was political controversy. There were rocket launches as the astronaut program and NASA was really starting to take hold in the imagination of the American public. The world was dynamic and filled with change, and she felt like she was part of that world, and that's part of the world she wanted to be involved in. She was part of that. On the other hand, after the news was over, she watched the television sitcoms that came on afterwards, which were almost exclusively centered around a depiction of life where women stayed home and didn't work. The men went outside and lived in the outside world, and they worked. Kids did, boys and girls, when they were really little, got to go outside of the world and go to school and go to explore the outside world. But mom was always home, vacuuming with her poodle skirt on, with her, pearls around her neck, pulling out that perfectly timed pot roast for her husband when he gets home, because he's hungry when he gets home from work, and he really likes that food to be prepared right when he gets home from work. There was some kind of mixed message going on in television that Douglas had a hard time understanding. Well, which is it? Am I part of that important generation that's going to change the world, that's part of a dynamic world of press conferences for political change and rocket launches? Or is my world going to be that stay-at-home mom who never seems to leave the house? Mixed messages you grew up in. Douglas has a really interesting discussion of Jackie Kennedy. We were just talking about her husband, John Kennedy. John Kennedy was elected president in 1960. He was assassinated in 1963. But the Kennedys were young, for presidents, and they were a beautiful, gorgeous couple. They were almost too good to be true. And Jackie Kennedy seemed like a new kind of first lady. She was educated. She was college educated. Before being married, she worked as a professional. She was smart. She was cultured. She was athletic and played sports. She was a kind of, on the one level, a role model for a kind of aspiring girl like Susan Douglas, right? Susan Douglas goes on to get a PhD and become a professor, all right? She was a smart kid. Jackie Kennedy was smart and talented. And so on the one hand, Jackie Kennedy was represented as this kind of qualitatively new kind of woman, this new kind of first lady. On the other hand, she was ultimately, the first lady is ultimately kind of like the first stay-at-home mom. Yeah, she used to work, but now she doesn't. She's not the president. Her husband is the president. Her entire purpose was to serve the needs of her husband that was president, to defer her needs and her desires for the sake of her husband and the country. So it kind of depends on how you see Jackie Kennedy. There's something of a mixed message about Jackie Kennedy. On the one hand, she could be inspirational to achieve a certain level of accomplishments in society, but she was also pretty clear. Her story is that men become presidents and women serve as enabling men to become presidents. Mixed messages. All right. That's what we're going to talk about in each one of our units, or each one of our lectures for the rest of this unit. We're going to talk about music. We're going to talk about the mixed messages in music. We're going to talk about television. We're talk about the mixed messages in television. Network news and news media. We're going to talk about the mixed messages. That's what Douglas is interested in. The ways in which the popular culture could be a source of inspiration and liberation for women, and also the ways in which popular culture could be repressive and try to hold down the expectations of women. That's what we're going to be dealing with. It's an interesting unit. I hope you guys enjoy it. I'll see you next time.